The vents were rattling, the overhead tiles were trembling, and someone had slipped a birthday card under a door that no one admitted existed. Dust carried a faint electrical smell as I stepped deeper into the west wing of the administration building, the part sealed since the renovation of 1998. The floor tiles were buckled from moisture, and the ceiling fixtures hummed with a tone too steady to be malfunction. I had come because of a plain white envelope that arrived in the mailroom 3 days earlier, addressed in blue ballpoint handwriting, to whoever is still in room 17. There was no room 17 on any map. The corridor jump-numbered from 15 to 19, a quirk explained by contractors as legacy alignment. But the card was postmarked from within the city, delivered through normal channels, time-stamped by the mail sorter at 0612. Inside, a folded sheet of discount store stationery read only, "Happy birthday, you deserved better." No signature, no date, no fragrance, just a soft indentation, as if someone had pressed their thumb into the paper while hesitating. I carried the envelope to facilities and they shrugged. I carried it to records and they insisted room 17 had never existed. Still, the handwriting had that tremor of someone riding in a moving vehicle, and the postmark was clean. Nothing about it felt like a prank. It had the weight of something meant for a specific recipient. 2 custodians off shift mentioned hearing a locked door slam during night rounds near the west wing. One said he saw a rectangular patch on the wall, the size of a frame, where the paint didn't match the rest, like something had been removed recently. Another said he smelled candle wax around that same section of corridor, even though no one used that wing for storage. I returned with a flashlight, a portable recorder clipped to my collar. The west wing had that stale silence of a space cut off from air circulation. My boots kicked grit that rolled like tiny pebbles. Somewhere behind the walls, a vibration pulsed, irregular, like a wash cycle stuck in transition. I followed it until it faded near the junction of the old faculty offices. On the wall between 15 and 19, I found a vertical seam I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't fresh, but the paint edge was too sharp for the age of the rest of the corridor. I traced it with my thumb. The wall felt slightly warmer. When I knocked, the echo came back a fraction too late, as if the cavity behind it was deeper than a standard office. I held the birthday card up to the seam. The envelope fluttered with the pressure change, very slight, barely there, like air was escaping through a narrow gap. I pressed my ear against the wall. A faint shuffling sound resonated from somewhere inside, too slow to be mechanical, too irregular to be plumbing. I checked the ceiling. A tile was misaligned directly above the seam, and its metal frame was bent downward. As I reached up to adjust it, a grain of plaster dropped onto my wrist. It was warm. The recorder on my collar picked up a small click. A second click followed, close enough to be from the other side of the wall. My flashlight dimmed for a moment, as if something had absorbed its beam rather than obstructed it. I opened the envelope again, searching for anything I had missed. On the inner fold, barely visible unless angled toward light, was a second indent. A tiny line, 0.5 millimeter deep, curved downward under the printed words, "Happy birthday." Not handwriting, more like pressure from something resting beneath the paper when the note was written. I pressed my fingers along the seam one more time, and the wall flexed. Not enough to see, but unmistakable under my palm. A hollow panel, not sealed, not dead. Someone had used it recently. The hallway buzzed with a low electric tremor as I leaned my weight against the seam. The panel shifted by a few millimeters, enough for a thin line of cooler air to slip across my knuckles. The movement wasn't smooth. It felt like fabric dragged against wood, as if something behind the wall resisted being opened. I steadied my breathing and pushed again. The panel clicked softly, not from a latch but from tension releasing in the frame. Dust sifted down in a diagonal trail. Behind me, the rest of the corridor stayed silent, the kind of silence that seemed to draw closer the longer I held still. The gap widened into a narrow vertical slit. I shined my flashlight inside. The beam caught particulate flurries drifting through a cramped void, no wider than a storage locker. The inner walls were raw concrete coated in a film of gray moisture, and a single cable ran along the right side, disappearing into darkness. About shoulder height, a metal plate jutted out the size of a small shelf. I reached inside and touched it. The surface was warm, almost body warm, though nothing inside the cavity suggested a power source. On top of the plate lay a folded square of cloth, I pulled it out and recognized the material immediately. Institutional cleaning rags. Standard issue. But this one had a rectangular imprint in its center, something heavy having sat on it for a long time. The dust pattern around the imprint was cleanly cut, like an object had been removed only hours earlier. Something else glinted near the back of the cavity. I extended my arm as far as it could reach and pinched the edge of a thin object. A laminated badge slid into view, its lanyard tangled around a hook. The photograph on the ID was washed out, as if exposed to heat, but the printed name remained. Nora H. Kellerman, Support Services. The expiration date, 2001. I checked the badge with the flashlight. Along the top edge were faint scratches, parallel, shallow, and evenly spaced. Not natural wear, more like someone had repeatedly pressed the plastic against a rough surface. A thud echoed from inside the wall, deeper than the cavity I was probing, something farther along the hidden space. My hand jerked reflexively, hitting the metal plate. The vibration traveled through my wrist, dull and directional. The sound wasn't mechanical. It had the density of something dropping a short distance and settling. I eased back and studied the panel. The slit, opened only part way, now seemed misaligned, as if the wall behind it had shifted slightly inward after the thud. The air seeping out carried a faint scent, paper warmed by old electronics. I checked the floor. A small streak of gray smudge led from the base of the panel toward the alcove of Office 19. It wasn't visible before. I ran my finger across it. The residue was fine, almost powdery, like decayed insulation or the interior dust of an obsolete machine. I followed the streak to the alcove. There, at ankle height, someone had wedged a transparent tape tab under the doorframe, a folding technique used by security patrols during building lockdowns. But this tape was old and brittle, its adhesive yellowed. When I tapped it, flakes broke off like dried leaves. Across the tape, written in faint pen, were two numbers, 17.2. I crouched lower. The tape wasn't sealing the door. It was marking alignment, an index point. Directly across from it, on the bottom edge of the opposite wall, was a second mark drawn in pencil, a vertical line intersected by a short horizontal stroke. I aligned the tape edge with the pencil mark. When the two met visually, the seam of the hidden panel behind me lined up perfectly. This wasn't a random maintenance void. It was part of a mapped system, someone's private, precise system. I returned to the panel and pressed my fingers against the edge. A subtle resistance pushed back, not mechanical, more like air swelling, as if the cavity beyond connected to a larger, pressurized pocket. I tried widening the slit. It resisted at first, then gave way with a dull, padded release, the way insulation sounds when torn from adhesive. The opening expanded enough for me to lean forward and angle my light deeper. A second badge lay farther inside, flipped face down, and beyond it, the faint outline of a file folder, edges warped from moisture. But what held my attention was the floor of the cavity, a set of shallow grooves scored into the concrete, running in a straight path to the right, vanishing into darkness. Rounded grooves, pressed repeatedly by the same object. The size and spacing made sense only for wheels, small ones, like those under a cart. The recorder on my collar clicked again, louder this time. The microphone indicator blinked twice, as if it had registered a nearby signal. But the building didn't broadcast anything on this wing. I leaned closer. The air inside the cavity suddenly shifted, not with a breeze but with displacement, something altering volume in the unseen portion of the space, like a door opening on a soft hinge somewhere much deeper. The grooves on the floor seemed to shimmer under the flashlight, not movement, reflection. A thin sheen of moisture had formed in seconds. Then something faint touched the front of the panel from the inside. Not a knock, more like a fingertip dragging slowly across the inner surface. The drag against the inner surface stopped as soon as I froze. The panel stayed half open, a narrow slice of dark concrete cavity breathing uneven air into the hallway. My flashlight steadied, the beam holding its shape, but the temperature around the opening dropped enough to prickle the skin on my forearms. I angled the light deeper, following the grooves on the concrete floor. The path continued past the point reachable by hand, then bent sharply to the right, as if hidden behind a second interior wall. The cavity was too large for a simple maintenance space. Someone had carved a corridor inside the structure, narrow and unlit. built to be accessed only if you already knew it existed. I slid my fingers along the right interior edge. A thin metal lip protruded beneath the concrete. An improvised rail bolted into place long after the building was completed. The bolts were mismatched. Some were rusted, others new, one still carrying a manufacturer barcode that hadn't faded. Whoever maintained the corridor had been inside recently. Another thud reverberated, softer this time, as if whatever moved deeper inside had shifted its weight rather than dropped something. It traveled along the rail, vibrating lightly under my hand. Instinct had me pull back, but curiosity pushed me forward again. I reached into the cavity and retrieved the folder I'd spotted earlier. The cardboard cover was swollen from humidity. The tab handwritten in faded marker, WKS-17 Access Logs. Inside were loose, curled pages. The first sheet bore a printed header from the building's original security firm, dated April 1999, listing door sweeps and occupancy tallies. The last column, meant to show room numbers, had every field filled, except one. Between 15 and 19, the log simply skipped the line. The blank space had been circled in blue ink, then circled again, heavier, as if someone kept returning to it over time. Beneath the logs lay a stack of narrow notepads. The top page carried a series of timestamps written in pencil, 0312, 0315, 0318, each separated by a short dash but no explanation. On the next page, a rough sketch, the West Wing corridor, doors labeled with quick strokes, and a small rectangle drawn behind the wall between 15 and 19. Someone had written beside it, active only when pressure holds. As I turned the notepad, a thin strip of magnetic tape slid out, the kind used in archival cassettes. No casing, just exposed tape wound loosely. I held it to the light. One corner carried an imprint matching the rectangular dent in the cleaning rag. The tape had been stored on that shelf for years, maybe decades, always underweight. Static crackled from my recorder, short, clipped bursts, nothing like interference. A pattern emerged. 3 clicks, silence, then 2, a pause, then 1 isolated click. Not random, but not language. I lifted the recorder. The clicks were stronger near the open panel. I held it inside the cavity. Stronger still. The signal didn't feel electronic. More like something inside the corridor created small shifts in air pressure that the mic interpreted as contact. I eased further into the opening, shoulders angled, feet braced. The hidden corridor ahead was barely a meter high. The rail on the right wall extended into the bend. Something metallic rested on it, just at the edge of visibility, about the size of a shoebox, mounted to a sliding mechanism. I reached out. My fingers brushed cold metal. The object slid half an inch along the rail with a muffled scrape. A faint smear followed its motion, like graphite residue. A number was stamped into the metal housing, 17.1. Behind me, the hallway lights flickered for the first time since I'd entered the wing. The fluctuation threw a brief strobe against the open panel, and in that half-second shift, I saw a shape inside the cavity. Not a figure, not a shadow. A rectangular silhouette, halfway down the hidden corridor, partially obscured by the bend. It looked like another panel door, but narrower, with a small dark window at head height. When the light steadied, the window reflected my flashlight, but something behind it blocked most of the beam. The obstruction was uneven, shifting slightly, as if suspended from a strap or hinge. I pulled back from the cavity, breathing slowly. The rail-mounted device, 17.1, rested where I'd nudged it, angled so its underside was visible. A small wheel protruded from it, coated with the same gray dust that formed the trail into Office 19's alcove. I touched the wheel. It spun freely for a second, then stopped abruptly, as if catching on a fragment of wire. When it stopped, the recorder emitted a single loud click. I angled the flashlight toward the deeper corridor again. The silhouette hadn't moved, but the dark window now reflected differently, no longer a solid block of shadow. Something translucent had shifted behind the glass. A texture like thin plastic worn by repeated impact. I leaned in, just close enough for the light to reach the window. Inside the narrow pane, a single fingerprint smudged the inside surface. Pressed hard, dragged downward, then repeated. Layered prints, same position. Only one finger. The fingerprint held in the beam like a suspended bruise. Opaque, ridged, unmistakably fresh despite the sealed corridor. I steadied my hand, watching how the smudge caught the light. The inner pane was coated in a thin film of dust, yet the print cut through it sharply, revealing clean glass beneath. Someone had touched it within hours, maybe minutes. The air inside the cavity shifted again. A soft compression, like the slow push of a door somewhere deeper. The rail-mounted device at my side vibrated lightly, its small wheel twitching, as though reacting to movement through the corridor's interior pressure. I angled myself lower and crawled partway into the opening, enough to view the silhouette fully. The narrow panel door ahead was metal, older than the building, paint cracked into small islands. The window was set into a rubber gasket, the type used in sound-dampened chambers. Beneath the window, a faint label remained, adhesive residue and a fragment of serif lettering, 17. I raised the flashlight and scanned the floor. The grooves deepened near the bend, pressed so repeatedly that the concrete had a smooth channel worn into it. The cart, whatever it was, had moved through here for years, maybe decades. The gray dust coating the wheel matched a thick layer settled along the lower edge of the door, yet the fingerprint suggested recent contact. The recorder clipped to my collar let out a new burst, 2 sharp clicks, then a long, low hum. Not interference, resonance. Something inside the second panel had shifted enough for the mic to register it. I reached forward and touched the lower edge of the narrow door. It resisted like a bank drawer. The metal was warm, not from electricity, but from trapped air. Warmer than the hallway, warmer than my hands. As I pressed upward, something inside pressed back, faint but real, an equal, opposite pressure, like someone holding their palm against the other side. I held still, feeling the weight of it, the steadiness, not a push, a presence. I shifted my grip, testing the frame for give. A thin vibration ran through the door, rhythmic but not mechanical. It wasn't machinery, it wasn't airflow. It felt like movement transferred through material, deliberate, small, repeated, like tapping. I lowered my face toward the window, keeping the flashlight angled. The smudged fingerprint stayed centered on the pane. I studied the ridge pattern, the oil streak, deep vertical drag, then diagonal, like someone tracing downward with effort. At the bottom of the smear, a faint curvature revealed the print had been made by a gloved finger, not latex, something thicker, worn. I exhaled slowly, fogging the outer pane. The inner smudge didn't shift. Then something else caught the light. Beyond the glass, faint horizontal lines ran along the inner wall of the chamber. Not scratches, indentations, rows of them, each the same length, spaced evenly. The pattern looked like scoring made by pushing a narrow metal edge repeatedly across concrete. My recorder clicked again, louder. The sound spiked into the red. At the same moment, a subtle change happened behind the door. Not motion, but the cessation of motion. The tapping stopped. I leaned back from the window, pulse spiking. The corridor had become too still. The warm air at the seams stalled, held, then shifted in a slow exhale that brushed my cheek with the smell of paper stored too long in heat. I began crawling backward, not abruptly but with controlled movements, keeping the beam on the door. The smudge on the glass remained unchanged. The channel grooves on the floor remained undisturbed, but the rail-mounted device, the one stamped 17.1, was no longer angled the way I'd left it. It had rotated slightly on its wheel, turned toward me by a few degrees, enough that the stamped number now faced the hall. I didn't touch it. Behind the narrow door, something answered the recorder's last click with a soft, internal shift. Not tapping, not movement, a breath. The breath behind the door was faint, but it carried a texture, not warmth, not chill, just displacement, as if a small volume of air had been taken and returned. I stayed half kneeling, half braced, letting the silence settle long enough to recognize the difference between ambience and intention. This wasn't plumbing or vent pressure. It was timing, measured, responsive. I slid back fully into the hallway and stood, keeping my eyes on the panel. The hidden corridor exhaled once more, lighter this time, followed by a dry tick of metal against metal somewhere along the rail. The wheel of the device stamped 17. One quivered again, then rotated another incremental degree. Not enough to feel random, enough to feel guided. I reached for it slowly. My fingertips hovered a centimeter from the metal housing. The moment my shadow passed over it, the wheel jerked. a short, stiff rotation, and stopped on a hard angle. A smear of new dust traced its arc. Whatever moved deeper inside had transmitted force down the rail. I checked the floor. A second streak of gray, thinner than the first, extended from the panel toward Office 19's alcove. Fresh, unbroken. The grooves inside the corridor weren't historical wear, they were active channels. I followed the streak to the alcove again. The brittle tape tab that had been wedged under the doorframe was no longer aligned. It had curled upward, adhesive exposed, as if the door had shifted subtly in a direction the hinges didn't allow. The pencil alignment mark on the opposite wall had faded under a new, thin scrape. Fresh graphite rubbed across stucco from something passing low and fast. I crouched. The gap under the door of Office 19 was darker than before. No airflow, no reflection. Just a dense black that swallowed the light from my flashlight until I positioned the beam perfectly flush with the floor. A strip of laminate rested just inside the threshold. My pulse tightened. I reached under and hooked it with 2 fingers. It slid out with the dry, crisp sound of old plastic. Another ID badge. Same layout. Same era. The name, Nora H. Kellerman. But the photograph was clearer. Undamaged. Colors intact. The stamp on the back showed the badge had been deactivated in 2001. The same name. 2 IDs. One decayed, found in the hidden corridor. One pristine, found placed, deliberately, under a door sealed for years. I flipped the badge. Scratches again. But these formed a recognizable pattern. 3 parallel lines crossed by a 4th, shallow diagonal stroke. A tally mark. 1 set. The first badge had shown multiple parallel scratches, too many to count. This one carried only the opening stroke, like the beginning of a sequence. A soft creak interrupted my inspection. Behind me, the hidden panel shifted wider by itself, only a fraction, no more than the width of a coin. But the movement was silent until the final millimeter, when a small rubber gasket squeaked. Air pushed out, stronger this time, and with it came a faint smell. Plastic heated near failure, like an old cassette motor left running too long. I raised the flashlight and turned back to the cavity. The second door inside, the one with the fingerprint, was no longer centered in my view. Something had nudged it from the inside, changing the angle of the window by degrees. The fingerprint smear widened along its lower edge, as if pressure from within had dragged it. Then the tapping returned. Not on the door, on the rail. The sound came from deeper in the hidden corridor. Slow, steady impacts, metal lightly striking metal. Something moving along the rail, following the grooves. Approaching the bend, I braced. The tapping grew sharper, closer. The wheel on 17.1 jolted each time, responding to the force transmitted along the track. The dust on the rail vibrated in small ripples. A silhouette emerged around the interior bend, low, box-shaped, moving with short bursts rather than a continuous glide. The cart, the same size suggested by the grooves, with a slurred outline and a dull metal housing. It rolled silently except for the soft hitch on each rotation of its wheels. A thin cord hung from its rear axle, severed unevenly, frayed into threads. It stopped just before the narrow door with the fingerprint. The recorder clicked in a sequence I hadn't heard. Click, click, pause, click. The cart responded, inching forward until its front edge touched the base of the inner door. A soft impact, enough to resonate through the corridor. The fingerprint on the window shifted again, not from touch, from vibration. Something behind the glass responding to the cart's arrival. Then the door's rubber gasket compressed. Slowly, incrementally, like weight leaned against it from the inside. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the hallway wall. The panel's air pressure wavered. The corridor lights buzzed. The door inside the hidden passage moved outward by a millimeter. Exactly 1 millimeter. Then stopped. The inner door's 1 millimeter shift held like a measured breath. The gasket, now slightly deformed, formed a thin crescent of shadow where no light reached. The cart stayed pressed against the metal, its housing tilted forward as though waiting for a signal I couldn't detect. The recorder vibrated once against my collar. No click this time, just a muted pop. The kind a mic makes when air pressure changes too quickly for its diaphragm. I raised it toward the cavity. The pop repeated, softer, distant, echoing from beyond the door. The corridor behind me remained still. Every fixture in the west wing hummed with the same steady frequency. yet somehow felt quieter because of the silence inside the hidden passage. I stepped forward until I was close enough to feel the warm air leak through the sliver between the door and its frame. A dull scrape sounded from inside, fabric against metal, faint but unmistakable. Then another, slow, dragging, intentional. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, catching the fingerprint smear at a new angle. The ridges seemed deeper than before, as if more pressure had been applied from the inside. The arc at the bottom of the smear had lengthened by a few millimeters. Someone was still trying to push through. I pressed my palm against the outer wall, feeling the vibration. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't desperate. It was patterned, a sequence of pushes, each measured, each matching the rhythm of the cart's earlier movements. I crouched and studied the rail. New dust had fallen onto the grooves, fresh enough to hold shape, delicate as ash. The cart had delivered something, or the corridor had carried something forward, and whatever was behind the door had responded. I leaned closer to the gap. Warm air drifted across my cheek, followed by a faint scent, candle wax and cardboard, heated long past comfort, the smell of something stored too close to a filament, and beneath it, the sharper note of ink. Slowly, I raised the birthday card I'd brought with me, holding it toward the seam. The paper caught a tiny upward current, lifting the edge by a fraction. The air behind the door shifted again, gentler this time, almost aligning with my breath. A shadow passed behind the window, not a figure, a shape, flat, rectangular, swaying slightly, hanging from the inner wall by a loop or strap. When it moved, the fingerprint below it blurred, as though brushed by proximity. Another scrape, fabric against metal. Then something slid under the inner door. Not out into the corridor, just enough that I could see its presence. A small object nudged against the lower gasket until the rubber bent outward. I lay flat and angled the flashlight through the gap. A corner of laminated plastic protruded from inside, pressed by steady pressure. A badge. Another one. The same size. Same lamination. The photograph blurred. Edges discolored. But the name was clear. Nora H. Kellerman. A third badge. And beneath the printed name, a new tally scratched into the surface. 2 marks. Parallel. The next stroke half started, cutting into the laminate but not finished. The pressure behind the badge increased. The gasket strained. Dust rose in a thin line. Someone inside wanted it taken. I reached toward the gap, sliding 2 fingers beneath the rubber. The badge pushed harder in response. The rubber frame bowed outward. For a moment I felt the faintest contact. Pressure against my fingertips, not from plastic, but from something on the other side. I drew the badge out. The pressure vanished instantly. The door's warmth receded. The corridor air cooled. The tapping stopped. I stood slowly, holding the third badge in my palm. The plastic was warm, body warm, and soft at the center where the tally marks had been made. The unfinished third stroke had dented the laminate but not pierced it. I stared into the cavity one last time. The silhouette behind the window had stilled, but not withdrawn. The shape hung there, silent, waiting. The recorder popped once more, a final, clipped sound, then nothing but the static hum of the hallway fixtures. I backed away from the panel. The warm air dissipated. The seam settled. The hidden corridor exhaled one last faint draft, and then fell still. When I reached the far end of the hallway, I looked back. The panel had closed by itself, not fully. Just enough to make the seam invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The badges in my pocket, 3 of them, shifted with the movement of my steps. 1 old, 1 new, 1 unfinished. Somewhere behind the sealed concrete, something adjusted its weight, redistributing pressure through the rails and channels, preparing for a sequence only it understood. And in the silence of the west wing, a single soft sound echoed from within the wall. A finger tapping once against glass.